Hi, everyone, and welcome to the current episode of Christianity Now. Our guest today is Dr. Leah Payne. Dr. Payne is Associate Professor of American Religious History at George Fox University and Portland Seminary. Her PhD is from Vanderbilt University, and she's also the co-host and co-creator of the Weird Religion podcast. We'll make sure to put that link in the show notes. Her first book, Gender and Pentecostal Revivalism, Making a Female Ministry in the Early 20th Century, won the 2016 Numa Book Award. And her brand new second book, hot off the presses, right
Thank
here,
you.
is God Gave Rock and Roll to You, A History of Contemporary Christian Music, published by Oxford University Press. And also, she is a fellow science fiction fan, but alas, we're not here to talk about that today, so we'll have to do that another time.
Next time.
My science fiction collection is actually behind me on all these shelves. So
I love it.
This is the home office. I have all the academic books at the school office. So
Sure. That's great.
I thought it would be only fitting. So welcome, Leah. Welcome today.
Thank you.
Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be a blast. I have been looking forward to this book for a while. We're friends and follow you on social media, and I know that you've been working on this for some time. So I'm looking forward to digging into it and hearing more about it in our conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to it too. Thank you.
Yeah. So let me start off with our standard question that I ask all of our guests, and it's comes directly to us from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and it's this: who is Jesus Christ for us today?
Well, I'm not a theologian. I am not a evangelical thought leader or anything like that. So I just have a basic, if you're a Christian, Jesus is the savior of the world, Son of God. Yeah. I got nothing. Other than that.
That is not a bad answer,
Yeah. I'm not gonna, I don't have any special. I grew up in the Foursquare tradition,
Mm-hmm.
so of course, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever.
Right there on the wall, right?
Yeah. If it's not an in compliance Foursquare church, if it's not somewhere in the sanctuary, that is in the bylaws. But anyway, so I have no updated version for you. That's all I got.
Well, that is a tried and true answer, so we receive that. So great. Well,
great.
we're going to talk a lot about your book today, and I was thinking first I would ask you this. So obviously your first book that I just mentioned is on Pentecostal revivalism and gender.
Mm-hmm.
The second book focuses on a somewhat different subject matter, and I'm curious how you got in your scholarly work and your research from your focus on point A to point B. To ask it another way, why did you end up writing on this particular topic?
That's a great question. And in some ways, I thought that I was moving away from Pentecostalism when I took up this project. I grew up in the Pentecostal tradition. It was a very nurturing environment for me in a lot of ways. And also Pentecostal scholarly networks were very nurturing, and it was a great experience for me. This will tell you how much things have changed in the scholarly world, because when I started working on God Gave Rock and Roll to You, I had it in my head that I needed to write about something less fringe than Pentecostalism in like historical studies. Because at that time, even though Pentecostals were quite literally taking over Christian communities all over the world, at least the practices Pentecostalism was still seen as sort of a fringe type of project to work on.
Yeah.
So I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go straight down the middle. I'm going to go general evangelical. And I, before I went into the academy, I worked in contemporary Christian music for a little while. And so I knew a little bit about the industry. And I started reflecting on contemporary Christian music as an American religious historian. So a lot of people, I mean, if there's, for people who are not familiar with CCM, which I can't imagine people who are listening to this podcast not being, somewhat familiar with it.
Yeah,
if you don't know what it is.
Yeah, if you're listening in, you probably know. If you're listening in, you probably know what it is.
You probably know. And it's often seen as a kind of kitschy thing, as it's often assumed, because it's entertainment, that it wasn't really the main event when it comes to having theological, political, cultural power. But if you think about it, and as I began to reflect on what contemporary Christian music was, I began to see it as a really powerful way of forming Christians, forming evangelicals. And I began to see the industry itself as the reflection of a kind of consensus about what evangelicalism even was and is.
Okay.
So it was really widely regarded, especially at its height, which the height of the business was the early 2000s. But I think culturally, the height was probably the late 90s. And
Wow.
at that time, CCM was seen as the soundtrack of evangelicalism.
Yeah.
So if it was, and it was, around for everything.
I graduated
Weddings.
high school in 1998, and then I was a
What
youth
was the
pastor.
song?
Oh, what was the song? I mean,
Yeah.
what was my song, or what was the
Well,
song?
like, was there a graduation song that people were singing? Like,
Oh, well, I was in a public high school, so there are probably some different songs, but
okay, right, right. Yeah.
but yeah, I want to. Well, in a few minutes, I want to ask you about the artist that you focused on back in that time. But yeah,
Yeah,
I
sure.
would agree. I mean that era. I mean, I still remember the first time where I was when I listened to that Jars of Clay album. I know where I was. Um,
Oh,
I was in my friend's Ford Bronco pulling out of my driveway, and he's like, "Listen to this," and I'm like, "What?" I mean, I also remember when I first heard the Weezer album, but that's another story. So
wait, yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Same sweater.
yeah,
Okay. So I would love to ask a follow-up question about that, which
yeah. Go
is
ahead.
that did you know that it was like what was notable? It was it Flood that you heard, and what was
I
notable
think it
about
was
that?
that opening track, that with the Latin chant in the back, and that
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
I was amazed that Flood was on MTV or VH1 or something like months later, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that that's an interesting. So I have a weird memory. So my story is I wasn't actually raised with a lot of CCM in the home
Okay.
because my dad was a real curmudgeon about contemporary Christian music. He didn't like it. He didn't think
Yeah.
that it was good. And so he didn't really offer like a ton of like contemporary alternatives.
Yeah.
So he but so I wasn't raised with it as like a part of the culture
Hmm.
of my home. But I do remember being in a youth group van, and someone there was a modern rock station,
Hmm.
and they played Flood, and I
Yeah.
remember someone saying that's a Christian song, and I said no way, because it sounded
Good.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
it's not just that, but it didn't sound like CCM,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
there's a kind of
Hmm.
shiny,
Hmm.
very polished, like the Nashville sound. It's a
Okay.
lot like country music. There's a really tight style of writing, and it didn't sound like that. And the writing is beautiful in jars, like lots of Jars of Clay music has really beautiful songwriting, but
Yeah.
it wasn't that style of
Yeah.
songwriting. So anyway, it's kind of funny that you bring that one up. And in the book, I talk about that album and Jars of Clay as a band as being kind of the beginning of the end
Hmm.
of what of the existence of contemporary Christian music and this kind of suite of evangelical media being
Okay.
able to create a bubble that
Yeah.
you could live mostly exclusively in if your parents were vigilant and if you were excited about it.
Hmm.
And eventually that was disrupted, but Jars of Clay having a hit on the radio,
Yeah.
it was pretty exciting, I think,
Yeah.
for a lot of youth group kids.
Well, I've had this go-to saying for a while that every youth group kid in the 90s, if they owned basically two CCM albums, owned that Jars of Clay album and Jesus Freak. These were the two
Okay,
albums
okay,
because they
okay.
came out, I think I happened to see this in your book, came out about roughly the same time, I think, right?
They did. Yeah, they did. Yeah. And if they had a third, it would have been an Audio Adrenaline or a Newsboys
Yeah, that makes
album
sense.
for sure.
For whatever reason, I was never like into them. So obviously, you've said that you didn't have a lot of CCM exposure in youth group age, but you encountered some of them. So do you have any personal go-to CCM artists that are ones that you
Oh,
enjoy or listen to or have listened to?
that's a great question. And there's some debate about whether or not this counts as CCM,
Okay.
but I was raised by parents who were a part of the Jesus movement
Hmm.
in San Jose in the Bay Area in
Okay.
California in the 1970s. So by default, my dad was not into the CCM of the 80s, but of course he was really into what's called Jesus music.
Okay.
So Keith Green, Larry Norman, Randy Stonehill, Second Chapter of Acts, all of those types of those groups. Still to this day, I really enjoy listening to them.
Hmm.
And I've played them. I have 2 little kids, and I've played their music for them. They
Yeah.
really like, which is kind of awkward because it's got some lyrics that need a little explaining to like a 7-year-old, but why don't you look into Jesus?
Yeah.
It by Larry Norman is still, there's a whole genre of like internet memes where they talk about how something still slaps or whatever. I don't even know if that's a phrase that people use anymore, but it's still good
Yeah.
is what I'm saying. I still
Yeah.
really enjoy it. But I'm the kid of people who were the sort of hippieized Christians,
Yeah.
that kind of came out of West Coast charismatic networks. And so I sort of feel like it's a prerequisite. You have to love that stuff. But I mean, just because we didn't play the music in my home, of course, I write about this in the book. I mean, it was just everywhere.
Hmm.
And so, if you went to any kind of youth group outing or something, it was
Yeah.
just there. And it was sort of like the air that people breathed.
I remember, I mean, and you know all of this because you've studied it all. There was for a season, there was this like subscription that my youth pastor got, and then I got. It was like a box of what the late posters and the latest CDs that came out, and so
Right.
that all that stuff came from there. And I forget what it was called. But anyway, it had one of those things, and we had a subscription for a little while. So I suppose I should tell you that I'm kind of like a moody youth group kid. I liked Jars of Clay, Sixpence,
Okay.
a band that I still think is awesome, which is called Chasing Furies. They put out one album. Every now and then I'm
Yes.
like, I want to listen to this album. Actually,
Wait,
the other, go ahead.
I gotta ask, where are you from originally?
I'm from New Jersey.
Okay,
So
okay, because I knew it wasn't the Pacific Northwest. Because I was gonna ask you about like the Tooth and Nail roster, which was right out of the Seattle area. Did you get
yeah,
into any of that stuff?
no, I'm a little vanilla, I
It's too
just,
edgy.
it's too edgy, I guess,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
yeah, really interesting. Well, I want to jump into the history a little bit of this,
Okay.
obviously, which is history, cultural analysis is the main focus of your book. So let me start off with this, just to get a sense of the scope of your book. Where does CCM come from? What is the main background for it?
Sure. Well, most people, when they imagine contemporary Christian music, they imagine rock
Hmm.
and they imagine the sounds of rock. So the origin story for in most renderings of contemporary Christian music is actually the Jesus movement
Okay.
when conservative white Protestants um, adopted and it finally accepted the idea that rock could be of use to them
Hmm.
for discipling young
Yeah.
people. But I wanted to look at the people, not the young people who were making music, because a lot of Jesus people and Jesus music, all those artists that I just listed, they were young people making music that sounded like the kind of music they liked
Yeah.
for one another, for other young people. But the people who were manufacturing and selling and marketing, like the people who put those boxes together for you as a youth group kid,
Hmm.
um, those were older people. And they were older networks. So I wanted to look at how did, contemporary Christian music grew, and it traveled along these older revival networks.
Okay.
So, because you're at a Assemblies of God school,
Hmm.
there were a series of camp meeting places. If for people who are familiar with the idea of a camp meeting, things happen in like the kind of the same meeting places where holiness people, Baptists and Pentecostals got together to have camp meetings in the
Yeah.
early 20th century. Those places were oftentimes venues for music festivals.
Yes. Okay.
So this is a multi-generational effort, and a multi-generational business. So my book starts in the early 20th century,
Hmm.
where a bunch of because there were these tech changes that democratized the print publishing industry. Prior to the late 19th century, most print publishing, and so that means most songbooks, came out of either two kind of big printing hubs, New York and Philadelphia.
Yeah.
And it was expensive, and so it was really in the hands of elite presses and well-funded, kind of well-endowed Christian organizations. But by the late 19th and early 20th century, printing, it was inexpensive enough for middle-class people to be able to start printing presses.
Okay.
And so a couple of people, John and Ava Green Benson, were converted to this really radical form of the holiness movement that eventually became the Nazarene Church.
Mhm.
In a revival meeting in an abandoned lot in Nashville, Tennessee. They were so moved by what they experienced that they created a publishing business. And eventually it became clear that the music was the thing that sold the best. So they were publishing holiness hymns, and their children would go on to found Benson Records, which is one of the largest and most influential CCM record companies. So the effort there is not to create rock music, not to create rebellious stuff, but it is to evangelize through holiness music. And so if you look at CCM that way, all of a sudden a lot of things start to make sense about what contemporary Christian music was and what the aim of it was. So I'm hoping to tell a story that reframes what contemporary Christian music is, which is not an effort to rebel, but actually an effort to raise children up in evangelical churches to be evangelicals.
So kind of technically speaking, a kind of religious enculturation.
Yeah. I think of it as a form of parenting, really,
Faith formation
caring.
in a certain sense.
Absolutely. And as the profitability of the business grew, and as the evangelical networks expanded, and then, what really helped the development of contemporary Christian music was not just incorporating rock, but also incorporating baby boomers, because they were the largest generation ever. And they were primarily white, and they had a lot of economic upward mobility. And so the industry really grew on their buying power and their conviction that they could and should raise their children in the faith in partnership with mass media makers. So things like James Dobson, and who a Nazarene, by the way, and all of these contemporary Christian music makers. This was an effort to raise kids, and in some cases it worked really well, and then in other cases it didn't turn out the way they hoped it would. And that's just always fascinating to me. So I don't know, for you, like, did you ever have a moment where you said, I don't think this CCM is for me? Or was it always a really, because people are all over the place on it. Some people are like, I loved it, still a huge part of my life. Other people say there was a moment where I just couldn't, like this, I went secular. Like when you heard Weezer Undone or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah. We clearly, the message about, well, this was interesting. So when I was in youth group, which I don't know, early mid to later 90s, in a small Assemblies of God church in southern New Jersey, very much we had that understanding of the secular music divide, and it was like a little taboo, but it wasn't necessarily being hardcore preached against. I remember going to Michigan to like a youth camp, long road trip, and we were listening to that I Would Walk 500 Miles song on repeat,
the Proclaimers, right?
Yeah, and maybe the Weezer album. And our youth pastor, whoever's driving, let us do that because it was relatively clean. But then there was also lots of other stuff as well. So, I think, but then interestingly enough, when I became a youth pastor, I was interning at the church in Princeton when I was in graduate school. And then when I was a youth pastor, also they danced, which I was like, what? It was dancing that was more the thing that was
What?
like, we don't dance. What's going on there?
Oh,
So,
really?
you know,
Oh, interesting.
they would just have like dance offs at the youth group, and it was whatever. But as when I was a youth pastor, I'm like, is this am I okay here? What's going on? And
That's
so it's one
so
of those things
funny.
where I necessarily didn't have strong convictions about it, but I knew what I wasn't supposed to do. If that makes sense.
No, I think that that's a perfect illustration of how powerful it was, because
Hmm.
it's like, who told you that? Well, no one needed to, right? It was
Yeah,
just sort of like, this is how we do things.
yeah.
And
Somewhere along the way, someone said, "Oh, dancing. I don't know. We can't do that." And that kind of thing. But it wasn't. I've never seen Footloose, but I don't think it was like that.
right, right.
Yeah.
I mean, I would love to, ask you so many more follow-up. We don't need to necessarily make it all about your upbringing, but I do think
We
it's
could have a
really,
counseling session
yeah.
later, I suppose, if we need to.
Well, were you raised assemblies?
Well, sort of. So, interestingly enough, our family background will be a little different. So, uh, my mother kind of came from a background that was classic, like 60s. We should go to church because that's what you do.
Right.
And really that was not a part of her life really
Okay.
much after that, except for a brief season. My father was raised in as he describes it, a relatively strict German immigrant Pentecostal pastor's household. And so rather than come into maybe faith, maybe through the Jesus movement, that was maybe around the time that he began to take steps away from regular church attendance and whatnot. So
Yeah.
in the 80s, I was born in 1980. So in the 80s, I didn't, except for maybe a vacation Bible school now and then, wasn't really a part of the church. It wasn't until I was in junior high, right at that crucial sort of, psychosocial time that
Right.
I became a part of the youth group. I became a believer, baptized, and that was my exposure to it. So I came somewhat late with not a lot of parental background in it, if that makes sense.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense, especially your own kind of perception of CCM.
Hmm.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
So then,
And
yeah,
oh, go ahead.
later I'd hear about Keith Green and these, but
Right.
it was more like an artifact than it was something that I ever experienced. Now, my
That
wife, her family, much more Christian. She's a little younger than me, but her mom loved Amy Grant. I mean, that was surprise, that kind of thing. So, and her father was kind of New York City, kind of Jesus movement era, became a Christian. So a little different, maybe.
Oh, that's so fascinating. Yeah, I love to hear those stories, and I love to hear, I mean, it's fun talking with you as someone who was raised in the Northeast, which was not a
Mhm.
major cultural hub for
No.
CCM. And in fact, if you look at CCM Magazine used to publish, especially in the 90s, they used to publish tour maps of, like they'd have a map of the United States
Hmm.
and there'd be like little dots where you could see different bands. And if you look, especially the summer months where people, the tour schedules were really in high gear, you'll see that the real base of contemporary Christian music as an industry was the South, the American
Yeah.
South, and then the West Coast.
Hmm.
And they're kind of different music cultures that are on, either, and there are always exceptions. So, I mean, hey, Carmen was from New Jersey. So, you know,
Come on.
y-
There is no more New Jersey CCM artist, I think, than Carmen. I mean,
I
come on.
know, I know, it's true. Of anyone who I had the most fun writing about, it had to
Hmm.
have been Carmen, because first off, industry type folks, most of them were very reticent to recognize his importance because
Hmm.
they didn't like his art, or
Yeah.
thought that it was, poor, which I said, I mean, my response was, you think it's easy being like David Copperfield meets Rocky
Yeah.
meets Liberace? Like, this is
Yeah.
an accomplishment. But so a lot of them were really reticent to recognize him because they didn't like his
Yeah.
art. But if you grew up in Pentecostal or charismatic circles, he was like the
There's
world.
that one song / music video where he goes to a witch's
A
house or something.
witch's invitation,
We
my
we
brother.
were at
Yes.
we were at a youth rally and they like played that there, when I was
Oh,
in junior high. I think I remember that. Yeah.
it was like a version of the Thriller album, yeah, or the Thriller
Mm.
music video in
Ah,
a
yeah.
sort of weird kind of
Yeah.
way. Yes. I mean, the Satanic Panic was made for Carmen, and
Yeah.
Carmen was made for the Satanic Panic.
So, Leah, I heard you mention kind of West Coast and kind of South. I mean, would you say these are the two main centers for CCM at its height?
Yes, absolutely. So I think, one of the fascinating things to me about CCM is that it became the soundtrack of evangelicalism, but it was not, it did not, the hubs of it, it was music produced by a relatively small group of people in a pretty specific part of the country. But through that, they had tremendous influence over the entire country. So, you as a kid, growing up in New Jersey, you had, if you were listening to, DC talk, then you were being really formed by people who were raised in these revivalist networks and were producing music, especially DC talk, that reflected a kind of a concerted conservative effort to influence American society and to enact very conservative political agendas around the country. So it's kind of funny. It's like you could be in a totally different part of the country, but be deeply influenced by these visions that come out of those networks.
Kind of a precursor of kind of the, I don't know if this is the right word, kind of the totalizing effect of social media we have in our own age, where it doesn't matter where you are, it's right in your pocket, and, it comes from, wherever. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I think though, evangelicals generally, charismatics and Pentecostals in particular, are very good at using mass media. They understand how it works. They understand how to communicate with people. I mean, look at all the televangelists and stuff. And that's something that if you are not raised in those, you might not recognize really how fast they are to adopt and adapt to whatever media it is. Now it's like there are all these TikTok evangelists on, sharing, like it's stressful for me because I feel like I'm too old to really be able to understand TikTok, but
I do not have it on my phone, but I feel like I'm missing out on something.
I don't know. I keep trying because I've been told you got to be there, but oh man, it's overwhelming for me. But yes, so there are, guarantee it, people out there with millions and millions of followers who are using that space. They're fast.
Yeah, I was arguing with a former seminary colleague of mine who were students at the same time. The Lilly Endowment had an initiative for preaching that they were taking grant calls for. And I was really intrigued with the idea of exploring social media and preaching and things like this. And my friend, who is a theologian, was just pish-poshing the whole idea that it could even theologically be counted as a sermon. And part of me says, well, it's happening, so why don't we figure it out? But that's a bit of a sidebar. So
you're gonna win that argument. There's no doubt about it.
So.
It's already won.
Thank you.
Yeah.
But all right, so this question starts off a little odd, but it's going somewhere. So one musical group out there who would not be CCM, but is amongst the most CCM adjacent artists since they started is U2, right? I'm also, someone asked me once if I liked U2, and I said, I'm a middle-aged white man. Of course I like U2.
What kind of question is that?
So in one of their concerts, this is like 97, 98, it's their Pop Mart tour, where they were kind of going into dance music a little bit, lambasting sort of stuff. And they have this huge lemon on stage. They built this whole thing. They're in Mexico City, and Bono says, "Thank you for building this, whatever this is." So my question is, what would you say evangelicals built in the CCM space? Like, what is that they
question.
built?
I look at in the book their aspirations, and I try to also chart the realities. So what did the industry media makers at that time, what were they hoping to do?
Yeah.
And many of them were very explicit about the fact that they wanted to, especially with CCM, the target audience, because it was pop music, was the target consumers were young people. They wanted to raise their children in the faith. I think that was one of the people that I quote in the book, someone who did sales and marketing in the Christian bookstore space. And for those of you who are too young to know this, for the vast majority of CCM's history, about 80% or so, if not more, of CCM sales came from Christian bookstores. So Christian bookstores were the
And
Oh,
that
go
was
ahead.
the age before it was Thomas Kincaid paintings and candles. That is the only thing they sold at Christian
That's
bookstores.
right. Yeah. So music was a huge, like music was distributed. CCM was distributed through these bookstores. So one of the bookstore people that I talked with said, if you want to understand this, this part of the business, you need to understand one word, and it's legacy. The goal of CCM was to establish Christian legacy, and really the target buyers of CCM were not children, but were mothers. In fact, there's as digital marketing took off in the 1990s, marketers developed a composite figure who they called Becky. There's some accounts where she's called Lisa, but Becky was the conservative white suburban mom who was the core customer of Christian bookstores and hence the core buyer of contemporary Christian music.
Okay.
So the aim, I think, of, the expressed aim was to help Becky's raise their children. And if, I'm a Christian mom, I care about the faith formation of my children.
Yeah.
I can empathize with that. And one of the things that I thought was that really added to my empathy for the Beckys of the world, because it can be easy to dismiss them as kind of Karens,
Yeah.
But one of the things that really heightened my empathy was that when CCM was at its height in the 90s and the early 2000s, parents generally were being flooded. This is like the rise of parenting culture, the idea that that this is something that exists outside of the evangelical space, but the kind of high stakes, high anxiety, like culture around raising children the right way.
We were also focusing on the family a lot in evangelical subculture.
1,000%. One of the people who ushered in parenting as a verb, like the idea that parenting is a vocation and a practice that could be perfected over time, is our old Nazarene friend, Dr. James Dobson. And so evangelical mothers were being, given this message again and again and again. Raising children in very specific and particular ways is your responsibility as a Christian, as a mother, and it's very high stakes. If it goes wrong, it's on you, in a lot of ways. And so you can see how if you are in that culture and you're being told one of the biggest dangers facing your children is popular music, and how you can solve that is by giving them substitutes for that. Because one of the things you didn't mention, but I would be willing to bet money, is that within those boxes that you were given as a youth group kid, there were probably comparison charts that would help a youth pastor or a mom know what kind of music,
I used those posters to decorate my youth room, and I remember when you were doing the research, there were posters, lots of things, but some of them were the comparisons. If you like Beyonce, you will like, if you like U2, you will like everything, but whatever it is. So
right. And some of them are very sketchy, the comparisons. It's like, what, a lot of times, but anyway, so I grew to really appreciate the kind of perpetual crisis feeling that was that impression that was given to parents. And so that really fueled a lot of it. So I think that was the express aim, raise Christian kids. What they accomplished, it's unclear about the legacy piece. I think that, it's a sort of a flat reading to say that they failed, because there are a lot of other reasons why evangelical institutions have been in sharp decline, but the truth is that they are in sharp decline right now. And so the promise of using mass media as a way of doing Christian formation and keeping young people in church as adults, I don't see that has in like on a grand scale. I don't know that I think that the highest hopes of the manufacturers of this culture and the consumers, I don't think they would probably be super happy with the results. But yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
I'm anecdotally using myself as a case study here, but again, based on when it's at its zenith, I'm kind of right there. And I am also, I guess, one of those youth group success stories. I came into the church at junior high, and not only did I stay a Christian, I'm like a super Christian.
You're like a professional, professional Christian.
So there's a certain sense in which, and with all due respect, I think maybe I've moved beyond much of some of maybe the whatever pieces of CC yet. Much like people, this phenomena you see in ministry, people lock into certain musical styles of when they were at their most passionate in their faith, when they were newly converted, or whatever it might be. Like the other night, I was, I mean, this is very self-confessional, but a friend of mine passed away a few years ago,
Oh
good friend
gosh,
from
I'm
youth
so
group days.
sorry.
Yeah, and his wife gave me some photos that she had from the 90s from when we were together, and I was up in my room scanning them to Google Photos, and I put the Jesus Freak album on and listened to it while I was doing that, And in addition to just sort of being, putting me back in that space, which is kind of partially what it did, although I don't know if he liked that music at all, but I did, at that time
Yeah.
or a little later, I listened to the music again, and there's some good stuff. So much that I listened to that album. That Billy Graham quote that's in the middle of it.
Oh yeah.
Have you ever seen the wind? I've never seen the wind. I've seen the effects of the wind.
That's pretty good.
I will just repeat that. Or sometimes I will joke to my wife, because this is a funny thing I'll do. There's a line on there that says, "And that is what an unbelieving world simply finds unbelievable." I will just say that
that's
randomly
Brennan
about.
Manning. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I will just randomly say that about everything. I'm like, Rachel, I forgot to do the laundry today, and that's what an unbelieving world simply finds. And it's just random quote, but it's so imprinted on my brain.
Right.
Yeah.
I have to tell you that one of the not funny at all. That was such a beautiful story. And it illustrates a point that I found out kind of unexpectedly, which is I put a Google alert on contemporary Christian music as I was writing the book, because I just wanted to see, and the thing that I was not prepared for was how often contemporary Christian music shows up in obituaries. Now I wrote my great aunt's obituary. So I happen to know very recently. So I happen to know that it costs a lot of money to put words in there. Even per character, the charge is high. So the fact that these people's loved ones, when it came to remembering their departed loved one, they thought to include contemporary Christian music as one of their interests or one of their core identity things, that means a lot. And I was very surprised. I have actually a little folder in my email inbox that's CCM obits, because there were so many of them.
Wow.
And I think that really speaks to the power of the power and the kind of, and I don't want this to sound disrespectful, the efficiency of a song, to just like take you to, and it could be any kind of music, but I think for evangelicals, contemporary Christian music, like, when you shared that story, I just thought of how fast all of a sudden you were there, and you were like your younger self and having all these, so I think I appreciate you sharing that story, and I'm sorry your friend died.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Thank you. Yeah. So one of the things, if you Google Leah's book, you will see the various blurbs that are out there about the book, both reviews and then summations of the book. And one of the things that I noted was this quotation. I don't know if it's directly from the book, but it's about the book. It says, "Your book explores how CCM shaped American evangelical theology and politics." So obviously that's a big claim, especially the political one. I'm curious if you could like, without spoiling too much of what's in here for those who need to buy the book and read it, like what would be an example of that, or where you've seen that?
Yeah. I think from the get-go, you see savvy evangelical media makers recognizing that music was a valuable tool. In fact, Billy Graham, the genius Billy Graham, he was one of the first conservative Protestants to look at Jesus music and recognize something that was valuable. And I think this is very well documented, so I'm not the first person who observes this, but it is in the book. But a kind of what many people consider to be the inciting incident of contemporary Christian music was a big music festival that Graham and others helped put on, called Explo 72. So it was in, spoiler alert, 1972. And at that point in time, Graham was a big proponent of Richard Nixon. And in fact, found a way to incorporate Nixon into not his person, but his presence. Nixon was campaigning at that time.
Uh-huh.
And so he found a way to incorporate him into that festival and saw the idea of like putting contemporary Christian or putting Jesus people out there with
Mm-hmm.
the aesthetics of hippie culture. Um, he saw an opportunity to take the aesthetics of it and retool the message for a kind of conservatism
Yeah.
that would become really an overwhelming majority of the folks in contemporary Christian music. They're always dissenting people. There are always exceptions to that rule,
Yeah.
but for the most part, and you know, I in the book I start with one of the earlier very successful uses of music for political ends and theological ends was temperance hymns. So hymns that were sung to discourage people from using alcohol, and then eventually hymns that were used to prohibit the manufacturing and sale of alcohol in the United
Okay.
States. It was a theological case they were making. Alcohol is the devil's brew. We need to be doing something different as a culture.
Yeah.
They succeeded, not long term, but they succeeded in doing that. That's incredible. So I think that, their history is replete with music being used as
Mhm.
a political tool.
Yeah.
But for evangelicals, it became a, for predominantly white evangelicals who wanted to shape the political tastes and convictions of their young people. It just made sense to
Yeah.
use pop music. And there are one of the interesting things is, there are always people who resisted that.
Yeah.
But in terms of just numbers, majority would be pretty conservative. And like in the case of a group like DC Talk, which formed famously at Liberty University,
Yep.
it's like pretty much, talking point for talking point.
Mm.
The political agenda of the Falwell family is seen in DC Talk's music. And for a time it was quite effective in
Mhm.
inspiring young people. So I don't know if as a young person, it'd be interesting. I'd love to listen back through some of the earlier DC Talk stuff with you to be like, would young you, do you remember that stuff? Because a lot of people, they
Yeah.
don't really remember it, and then they listen to it and they're like, oh wow,
Yeah,
huh,
I really, yeah, and that's interesting too because of the age that I was and when I came in. I think I got before they stopped doing as much rap, I got one tape at a Christmas party. And then, but then it was just Jesus Freak, and it was a bit of a different style of music at least. But
right, right.
I mean, famously slash infamously, I mean that "I Don't Want It" song,
Oh
which
yeah,
has I don't want your sex for
for
now.
now,
It's this
yeah.
whole like
Oh
thing,
my gosh, yeah, yeah, the sex stuff is so funny.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, there are tons of DC Talk is certainly not the only one. In the book, I list
yeah,
a very long list of
hmm
artists who had it was the
yeah,
prerequisite "Don't Have Sex" song.
yeah,
And now it's so funny when you think about it. So I think people, the idea was pop music, a lot of it is about sex, which
hmm
is objectively true. And I
yeah.
think the idea was we'll create another message, and some of them
hmm
are, let's just say they are not subtle.
So one of the things you mentioned just a minute ago was, and I think you talk about this in your book as well, was you mentioned particularly white evangelicals.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I think I know the answer to this question, but did CCM have much, if any, entree into uh, non-white evangelicals or Christian spaces?
Yeah. So wait, did the music of CCM cross into
Did
non-white
it
spaces?
was it adopted? Was it listened to?
Y-
Was it a part of that or not? Especially African
Yeah.
American. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. For an industry, CCM is an industry. If you trace it back to the early 20th century and their Southern holiness revival networks, it's not going to be a huge surprise to know that it was segregated from the get go, like
Yeah.
most of American society.
hmm Yeah.
And like a lot of early recorded music industries, it was all segregated. And so every now and then there would be an exception to that rule. CCM stayed white longer. So
Okay.
as the top 40 charts began to diversify and began to reflect an increasingly multicultural American society, contemporary Christian music charts resisted that. And I argue that a lot of that has to do with the sales networks. So
Okay.
initially CCM, like in the late 1970s, early 80s, 90s, it was built on the prosperity of the American suburbs,
Hmm.
which through a lot of official and unofficial anti-Black and just generally racist practices were white. The suburbs were
Hmm.
overwhelmingly white. Of course, that's not the case now, but so contemporary Christian music, as the music of that served those communities, it was very rare that you would see a non-white artist. And when I first started doing research, it was sort of hard because, when I would ask people who were involved in the industry, and most of them got uncomfortable with
Yeah.
the question. This is me, I went into it with scholar brain, and
Hmm.
I should have been a lot more um, sensitive, but I said, hey, any thoughts about why it was so white? Because I just thought it was obvious.
Yeah.
And at first that was sort of like, whoa, whoa, whoa. But if you look at the statistics, it's just like
Yeah.
definitely true. But
Yeah.
one of the interesting things that and CCM had a lot more market advantages compared to other non-white music making, um, especially Black gospel, which is what most people are familiar with, but many
Yeah.
other kinds of like non-white sacred music. So
Mhm.
they enjoyed a lot more market advantages. There was a lot more money in it, and
Yeah.
there were a lot more empowering relationships that
Yeah.
facilitated that. But one of the interesting things that I found was that for many immigrant families, contemporary Christian music became very influential in their household, in part because the parents that were not from the United States, when they arrived here, they were concerned about the formation of their children. So they went to Christian bookstores, and CCM seemed like a really good option. So a lot of people, so I created a survey, and over 1,200 people responded to it. And a lot of responses that I had, and I included a couple of examples in the book that were kind of representative comments, but a lot of young people who grew up in first generation households were very deeply influenced by Stephen Curtis Chapman,
Hmm.
Steve Green, Sandy Patty. So in a really interesting way, CCM had a much broader
Yeah.
influence than the imagined market. Because the idea, all the marketers imagined that they were going after these Beckys, but they kind of indirectly influenced a lot of other
Yeah.
folks. And I should say there are a lot of great Black artists that charted on contemporary Christian music charts and made a huge impact in Black gospel music and then top 40 music. But the limitations of the market meant that for the most part they were white audiences and
Okay.
white consumers.
Yeah. So our time goes short. I know that you
Yeah,
have some other things going on today. So just kind of two more questions from me. One that I've observed, but I'd love to have your expert opinion on.
sure.
Clearly, it seems that contemporary Christian music, as I knew it in my early youth pastor and youth group days, has been eaten by praise and worship, by worship music.
Yes,
Why
yes.
why did that happen? Uh,
Oh gosh.
'Cause you would agree that it's happened, yes? It's just
Yeah,
happened. So
absolutely.
my question is, why did that happen,
Well,
or how?
I'll
I
I'll
suppose.
just give you like one or two reasons, because I talk about a lot of them and I don't want to, talk your ear off about
Mhm.
that. But I think I'll just give you one that I
Mhm.
think might be especially of interest to people who are in church work today, which is that the way that one thing that explains the ascent of worship music is that the way that people worship has changed over
Okay.
time. So statistically, and some of the statistics that I cite are actually pre-pandemic, but most of the stuff that I'm seeing now that is post-pandemic maybe shows that the trends are actually accelerating, that we're already kind of in place. But people are worshiping less often in larger congregations. So mega churches are growing, and small churches are getting much smaller, and medium churches are almost non-existent now.
Yeah.
And if you think about CCM as a form of entertainment that was birthed out of evangelical spaces and served evangelical audiences, the church networks were really key development networks. So if you were a little band, maybe you had did you ever have a band in New Jersey?
I was the sound man for our band, but
That's so
I still
sweet.
have the tracks from summer 1995, like on my computer. So
I love it.
Yeah.
What was the band called? I got to know.
It was a quote. It was a quotation from some book. It was "To Mercy, Pity, Peace, and Love" was the band.
Cute. Okay. To mercy, pity, peace, and love. Say to mercy, pity, peace, and love. That's kind of a tongue twister. Say, y'all, you get, you start off, you're doing a little coffee shop outside of your church, and then you start to tour around. And then, so you need, what I'm saying is, I already forgot the name of the band. To mercy, pity, peace, and love. Your band would depend on smaller churches, and then medium-sized churches, and then bigger churches. So the development networks are greatly diminished. And then on the other side of that, mega churches, their capacity to do pop music super well has heightened. So you don't need a touring band to do like incredible professional level music. A couple of the biggest ones out right now are Maverick City and Elevation.
Yeah.
And if you watch their music videos, I'm like, where's a better live music performance happening? I don't know. Maybe I'm sure somebody's going to argue with me about that, but I'm just saying they're doing it at a really high level.
Taylor Swift fans are going to really argue with you about that. But
yeah, they will. They will. I won't argue. Taylor Swift, Beyonce, they're in leagues of their own. But the capacity of the churches has changed.
Yeah.
So a lot of it is sort of market pressures, but then I really, you just can't underestimate the internet, because so much of what sustained CCM was the ability to create a parallel entertainment universe that lagged behind popular culture, but was a close enough approximation to satisfy certain, tastes and affinities for young people. And the internet just obliterated that. Because now, unless you're getting really radical and really able to manage things in your household, you probably cannot keep teens from finding music on the internet. It just happens. And it happened in our lifetimes. We were a little bit old for that, but still.
Again, not to be all monocausal about it, but the rise of internet accessibility, you could draw a chart of the decline of CCM from its peak and the rise of internet accessibility, and they're going to move in opposite directions.
Totally. Now, worship has really thrived in that. And I think one of the things that I pointed out is that the kinds of communities that are creating this worship music, they are transnational charismatic churches. So the vision of CCM was pretty American. And charismatics, they've always been like to the nations, however clumsily they've done it, but they're like trading songs all over the world together. And that, I think they don't need a bookstore. They've got these transnational conversations going on that are decades old, by the way. And the book looks into that a little bit, but yeah, I think, people have asked me, like, could CCM exist again? And I don't really know. I can't imagine it existing the way it was in the future. Christians will always be making music. They will, and the internet has allowed for many different kinds of Christians to find audiences. So that has never stopped. But that world, I don't know that the conditions are right for it.
Yeah,
that could change, I guess.
Yeah,
but
it does feel like a bit like a lost world. If in the same way that dialing up to AOL was a lost world, or or things like that, it doesn't come back.
The kind of
exactly.
Yeah, it's not gonna be that good.
I am fully into nostalgia, I guess, at the moment. They came out with a updated sequel to that 70s show called That 90s Show, which I have watched now twice on Netflix. So
is it
while
good?
I'm on the treadmill, It's kind of fun. Yeah.
Okay.
The main character is literally my age in 1995. So I feel like, oh, there we
sweet.
are,
You got to watch it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So everybody, Leah's book, God Gave Us
Thank
Rock.
you.
God Rock and Roll to You. It is on sale, even though officially it's not released for a few days. But by the time this podcast comes out, it'll be out. So I got my copy on Amazon, just came in yesterday.
Thank you.
A last big question for you.
Sure.
Do you have a Spotify playlist we can listen to while we're reading your book?
I'm working on it right now.
Okay, good.
Yes, I promise. I will get it to you. Yep.
Good.
Yep,
Would love the soundtrack in the background while I read the book.
I need to do that.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you got a lot of other things going on too. So, Leah, where can we find you on the internet if people want to learn more about you or your work or what you're up to?
Sure. Thank you so much. On most social media accounts, even including TikTok, you can find me at drleahpayne.com. So DRLEAHPAYNE. Or no, not .com. My website is drleahpayne.com. Social media handle DRLEAHPAYNE. And I love to interact with people in that world. And I hope y'all find me there.
Great. And of course, if you're interested in hearing more live from her or audio from her, the Weird Religion podcast is out there, and you're still continuing with that project, right?
Yes, we're on a short hiatus.
Okay.
But yes, and I've worked on kind of a companion. Well, it's not. It's a project in and of itself called Rock That Doesn't Roll, which is a podcast for PRX that explores the lives of contemporary Christian music fans. You should listen because I feel like you'd find, your people there, that I co-host with journalist Andrew Gill, and that one's been a lot of fun.
Great, excellent. Well, thank you so much, and I appreciate you